The Philadelphia Eagles just gave the Detroit Lions a blueprint for the Super Bowl. And the best part, the Lions aren't very far away from building that blueprint. And today, we're going to take a look at exactly how the Detroit Lions can build their roster to replicate what the Philadelphia Eagles just did this past season, and how the Detroit Lions can win their first Super Bowl in franchise history. Now, before we get into the Detroit Lions, before we get into how the Detroit Lions are constructed and why they aren't as far away as some people would have you believe, I want to take a look at the Philadelphia Eagles, take a look at what they did in their dominant victory on Sunday night, and talk about whether or not the Detroit Lions can get to a point next year where they can replicate what Philly just did to Kansas City. And the biggest takeaway from last night was the defense. Philadelphia won this game almost entirely off the back of their defense. In a 40-22 game, Patrick Mahomes was sacked 6 times. The Philadelphia Eagles allowed just 49 rushing yards. The Philadelphia defense held Kansas City to be just 3 for 11 on third down and 0 for 1 on fourth. Their pass rush was ferocious. Their run defense was unstoppable. Kansas City went into halftime with just 4 rushing attempts for 3 yards. That's how good the Philadelphia front seven was. And that is where the Detroit Lions need to get to. This past season, they weren't a bad defense by any means. They were a great scoring defense. They were a good defense as far as not allowing touchdowns and taking the football away. But they gave up yards after yards after yards. They gave up chunk play after chunk play after chunk play. And even though it didn't always come back to hurt the Detroit Lions, their defensive line and even to some extent their linebacking core really struggled this season. And it's a big reason as to why they fell in the divisional round and the Philadelphia Eagles won the Super Bowl. Now, the Eagles Super Bowl team, their construction is really primarily made up of 4 to 5 different things that make them great, right? And I would say those things are as follows. The Philadelphia Eagles Super Bowl makeup is their elite offensive line, both size and weight wise. They are fantastic. Each of their starting 5 offensive linemen are Pro Bowl to All Pro caliber. They move the ball at will. They gave Jalen Hurts tons of protection. They've opened up running lanes for Saquon Barkley all season long, and it gives Jalen Hurts the ability to throw to his very good wide receivers and get chunk plays down the field. The second big takeaway, the second big pillar to their construction is their elite run game, and that builds off the offensive line, right? Saquon Barkley had a top 10 rushing performing season of all time, passed 2,000 yards on the ground for the first time since 2012 from a running back. They run the ball and they run it really, really well. It keeps the offense on schedule. It puts points on the board. It is a pillar of their offense. Yeah, Jalen Hurts is flashy. Jalen Hurts runs. Yeah, A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith are really good. Yeah, Dallas Goedert is a fantastic tight end. It doesn't work without Saquon Barkley. And we saw it last year not work without Saquon Barkley. With guys like DeAndre Swift, Miles Sanders, they weren't nearly as prolific as a rushing team as they were this season. But you bring Saquon into the building, you up that rushing attack almost immediately, and the Eagles go from being a wild card exit to Super Bowl champions. The third pillar is the pass rush. And this is the one where the Detroit Lions are really, really lacking. Their pass rush is fantastic. They've put first round pick after first round pick after first round pick into that defensive line, and it's paid off for many of the last few seasons, right? Nolan Smith was a first round pick. Jalen Carter, Jordan Davis. You look at them trading for Bryce Huff in a big move. You look at Brandon Graham was a first round pick. You look at all of the different players, and there are 4-5 guys on that defensive line that you could consider to be either 10 sack guys or top 5 to 10 players at their position. Jalen Carter is one of the best young defensive tackles in football. Josh Sweat is a 10 sack type of player. Nolan Smith came into his own and played like a top 10 defensive end throughout the playoffs. Player after player after player were so incredibly influential and impactful in that game. And the fact that they didn't just have 2 or 3 great pass rushers, they had 2 or 3 great pass rushers with 4 or 5 guys behind them that could put up 5, 6, 8, 10 sacks in a season. That is what made the Philadelphia front seven so incredibly special. Another pillar, good secondary. I think Darius Slay held it down, but so did Quinyon Mitchell, Cooper DeJean. Their safeties were really good. They weren't the best secondary in football as far as, talent-wise, and I think they, got exposed a little bit throughout the game, but they were good enough to not give up big chunk plays, to take the football away twice, and to really not be a liability on the defensive side of the ball. And the fifth pillar is that the Eagles don't have a weakness. They don't have a spot on their roster that you can look at and say, that's what we're going to attack. You look at their defense, right? Their front four, really good across the board. There's not one player that you can really focus on because the rest of them will eat you alive if you do. The linebacking core, I don't think their linebackers are incredible, but Zach Bond was a great player this year, had an all-pro type of season. Again, not a big weakness on the linebacking core. Zach Bond was elite. The rest of them were serviceable. You have a good front seven. Their secondary, Darius Slay probably isn't the same player he used to be. Still really good. Cooper DeJean, Quinyon Mitchell, really good players. The Eagles safeties, really good players. There isn't a clear weakness to attack on defense. And for the offensive side of the ball, they were good enough everywhere to be competitive, right? If they somehow took away the run game from you, Jalen Hurts is good enough to run an offense for a couple of drives. A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith, Dallas Goedert, the offensive line are good enough to keep your offense afloat, even if the run attack isn't working early. And the rushing attack is so good that eventually it will break through and will eventually have a good moment. That is how the Philadelphia Eagles won. They had no clear weaknesses. They had an elite offensive line. They had an elite pass rush. They had a good enough secondary, and they got it done. The good news is that the Detroit Lions have very similar things. You look at the Detroit Lions offensive line, they're top three, right? They are one of the best offensive lines in football with Penei Sewell, Frank Ragnow, Taylor Decker, Graham Glasgow, Christian Mahogany, Kevin Zeitler might be coming back. You draft a guy, you sign a guy. They are one of the best offensive lines in football, in particular in the rushing attack. Their run game was top 5 in the NFL, despite not being top 10 in carries this year. Jahmyr Gibbs is a top 5 running back in football, and David Montgomery might be the best running back too across the entire league. They have a great 1-2 punch in Sonic and Knuckles, and they are one of the most dynamic and dangerous rushing duos in all of football. You look at their secondary was top 10 this year. They allowed very few touchdowns through the air. They were top 5 in takeaways this year in the secondary. And yeah, while they allowed a lot of chunk yardage, they didn't allow a lot of touchdowns. They took the football away. And at the end of the day, you could give up a lot of yards, but if you're not giving up points and you're getting extra possessions to the offense, you're going to win more games than you lose. And they don't have a weakness. If you look at the Detroit Lions offense, there isn't a bad player on it. You look at the Detroit Lions defense when healthy, the front four was really good. The linebacking core was good and healthy and deep. The secondary was good and healthy and had some quality depth to it. Injuries were massive for this season, right? And a lot of people are going to look up statistics and say, oh, the linebackers were really bad this year. Oh, the defensive line was really bad this year. Yeah, that's what's going to happen when you have 22 players on injury reserve. But when they don't have those players on injury reserve, when Hutch and McNeil and all of these players come back, there isn't really a true weakness on the defensive side of the ball. Now, the biggest difference between the Detroit Lions and the Philadelphia Eagles is the investment on that defensive line. You look at what the Eagles have done. Jordan Davis was a first-round pick. Jalen Carter was a first-round pick. Nolan Smith was a first-round pick. Brandon Graham was a first-round pick. Josh Sweat was a third-round pick. Milton Williams was a third-round pick. Jalix Hunt was a third-round pick. Moro Ojomo was a seventh-round pick. They invest every single year. Most years very highly. Within the first 2 days of the NFL draft, they invest on their defensive line. And it's why their defensive line is so deep. It's why their defensive line is so talented. It's why Jordan Davis and Jalen Carter and Nolan Smith and Brandon Graham and Josh Sweat and Milton Williams all get really good numbers, really good statistics, and are looked at as really, really quality players because there is significant depth and significant talent. You move that over and look at the Detroit Lions side of things. Yeah, they've invested. They drafted Aiden Hutchinson second overall. They drafted Levi Onwuzurike in the second round, who's had some injury concerns. They've drafted Josh Paschal in the second round, who didn't quite work out. You have McNeil in the third round, who's been fantastic. Martin in the third round, who wasn't great. And then Mekhi Wingo in the sixth round, who has shown some flashes, but is a sixth round pick, and you can't rely on that to be your star. And that's it. The investment is significantly less, and therefore the product is significantly lessened for the Detroit Lions. Had they invested and drafted Jalen Carter over Jahmyr Gibbs, had they drafted, players X, Y, and Z over the guys that they did, they would have a really good defensive line. If they had drafted better in the third round, in the second round, they could have a really good defensive line. So part of it is hitting on your draft picks, and part of it is making the most of your selections. But you can see the clear disconnect between the Eagles and the Lions when it comes to investments put into the defensive line and results taken away from the defensive line, right? The Eagles put 4 or 5 first-round picks into the defensive line. They're one of the best D lines in football. The Lions put one couple day 2 picks into it, and they have a decent defensive line. Not great, but not awful. The Detroit Lions pass rush going into 2025 isn't really all that impressive. Aiden Hutchinson should return and will be really, really good. Zadarius Smith is still on the roster if he is not cut. And I think he's a good, second, third tier edge rusher. You have Josh Pascal who returns, who I think is a great edge setter, but not a great pass rusher. You have DJ Reader, who again is a good run stopper, good nose tackle, not a great pass rusher. You have Broderick Martin, who might not even make the roster, to be totally honest with you. And then Mekhi Wingo, who again is a good interior pass rusher, is a good third down specialist, but you need more. You need more of a pass rush than Aiden Hutchinson, a 32-year-old Zadarius Smith, and Mekhi Wingo, right? John Kaminsky is gone. Levi Onwuzurike is gone. Al-Qadim Muhammad is a free agent, right? All of the guys that were rushing the passer last year are pretty much gone. And the guys that are returning are better run defenders than pass rushers. And while they're good run defenders, that's their role. They don't have pass rushers like the Philadelphia Eagles do. And I think that's where the Detroit Lions really need to put their capital this year, because they have capital, right? In 2025, the Detroit Lions have a first, a second, a third, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth, and 2 seventh-round picks. They have the capital to move up. They have 4 picks on the first 2 days in the 2026 NFL draft. So if they want to trade up, they have that ammo to go do so with. And they can do it. They absolutely can. I put a mock draft up right now. I kind of did one this morning just to kind of give an idea, a thought of where the Detroit Lions could potentially go in the draft. And honestly, I see the Detroit Lions putting 2, if not 3 picks on this defensive line. I see them drafting a defensive tackle, an edge rusher, maybe even 2 edge rushers, and really putting the pedal to the metal when it comes to drafting defensive linemen. They need to get better on the defensive line. And I think that those sign players, I'd love for them to go out and sign Josh Sweat. I'd love for them to go out and get, a couple of players on the defensive line throughout free agency to really fill out the depth with some good pass rushers. But your long-term success is going to come through the draft. That's where Brad Holmes has found success in the past. That's where Brad Holmes needs to continue to find success as we go forward. And if the Lions can hit on their draft picks, if they can do and put together a draft like this, if they can put together a draft where they bring in young, studded players that can impact the game early and often and rotate and be impactful, they will have a good shot at a Super Bowl. For the Detroit Lions, a Super Bowl run is simple. It's not easy, but it is simple. There are a couple of steps. Keys to Super Bowl 60. You sign a veteran cornerback, whether it be re-sign Carlton Davis or signing a player like Charvarius Ward. You sign a true number 1 cornerback from free agency or trade for one, whatever works. You invest in the defensive line, and you don't regress on offense. And they shouldn't regress on offense. They are still very, very good. They still have a top 5, top 3 offensive line with Decker, Glasgow, Mahogany, Ragnow, and Sewell. They are still one of the best offensive lines in football. With Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery, they will still be one of the best rushing attacks in football. With Jared Goff, Jameson Williams, Sam Laporta, Amon-Ra St. Brown, they should still be a great play action team with great reliable wide receivers and the ability to do what they did on offense a season ago. They're not losing a single offensive starter outside of potentially Tim Patrick this year. The offense should be just as good, if not better, going into this season. Their pass rush is the question mark. Even their secondary, Robertson, Arnold, Ennis, a couple of veteran players. I think you bring back Kendall Vildor. I think, Khalil Dorsey's probably going to be on IR, but you bring back Khalil Dorsey, right? You invest in the defense. You draft maybe a cornerback or at least a versatile secondary safety. You invest in the defensive line. You assign a player of decent quality to replace Emmanuel Mosley on the depth chart. You re-sign Carlton Davis. Your secondary looks really good. And then you go into the draft and you go D-line, 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 pass rusher, pass rusher, pass rusher. That is what the Detroit Lions need to do. And I think that's what they are going to do this season. That is the blueprint. That has been laid out plain and simple and clear as day from the Philadelphia Eagles. If the Lions want to win a Super Bowl, they will draft defensive linemen. They will invest heavy assets into the defensive line so that it doesn't happen what happened this year. Yes, injuries were massive. Yes, losing Aiden Hutchinson, losing Aleem McNeil would be devastating for any team. But if the Detroit Lions lost Jalen Carter and if the Detroit Lions lost Josh Sweat, guess what they still had? They still had a lot of quality players. They still had Milton Williams. They still had Jordan Davis. They still had Nolan Smith. They still had Brandon Graham for some of the season. They still had Jalix Hunt. They still had all of these quality players, and that's where the difference is: the depth, the talent, the ability to consistently impact the field is where the Detroit Lions need to be better on defense. And that's where I think they need to invest. That is the blueprint. That is how the Lions get to Super Bowl 60. And we'll talk a ton about it as the draft season comes on. So, with that being said, let me know down in the comments below your biggest takeaway from the Super Bowl. Let me know your blueprint for the offseason that you want to see the Detroit Lions follow. I'm curious to hear your guys' opinions, if they are similar or different. I'd love to hear your guys' opinions as well. But with all of that being said, thank you all so much for watching. And until next time, and as always, go Lions.